Welcome back to Perspectives on Human Communication. This is a brief overview of social penetration theory. This would be a short one as the concepts within this theory are pretty basic, but the theory itself is really one of the more practical and intuitive theories that we'll look at, meaning that as we talk about these concepts, most of you will recognize them in your own life and your own relationships. So, quick overview of what this theory is saying. Social penetration was put forward by two scholars, Taylor and Altman, and they were suggesting that the process of bonding that happens between people as they get to know each other moves a relationship from that of a superficial interaction and acquaintanceship to more of an intimate, close bond. And it happens via verbal, nonverbal, and environmental behaviors. One particular concept is going to stand out among all of the other concepts as we look at this theory. So I mentioned Altman and Taylor started this theory back in 1973, and they did approach it from a socio-psych tradition. So they researched couples, and they did that through sometimes experimental conditions, sometimes they were interviews and instruments using self-disclosure instruments. I mentioned there was one concept that was primary amongst all of the concepts, and that is self-disclosure. They suggested that self-disclosure is the sine qua non of relationship development, meaning that this is the thing that really moves us toward intimacy. And it's a two-edged sword because as we grow in intimacy and openness in revealing ourselves to others, we also increase the vulnerability to being hurt. And so as we become more vulnerable, that really sometimes attracts people to us, or it makes us somebody that they want to get to know because we are willing to open up to them. And we all love being close to people and them knowing us and us knowing them. So they try to explain the relational closeness between people in this theory, and they do suggest that these relationships evolve in somewhat predictable, gradual phases, and we'll explore those by looking at the assumptions of SPT. So the first assumption is that relationships do progress from non-intimate to intimate relationships. And as I mentioned, they do so in a systematic, predictable fashion. So those are the two really foundational assumptions, is that as we get to know people, we're acquiring more information about them, information that other people don't know, which is what makes us closer friends, the people that we decide to reveal ourselves to and open up to, and that there are stages or phases, a progressive path that people follow in doing so. The third assumption is that the stages or phases of a relationship are not necessarily all progressively more intimate. So while sometimes we are getting to know each other better, there are times when we don't talk to the people that we know for a long time, and maybe we fall away a little bit from them and don't stay in touch. And so there can be these phases of what they call deep penetration. So while we're penetrating each other's lives, as we're beginning to get to know each other, maybe sometimes that slows down. Maybe we don't see them on campus as much, or we're not rooming with them that year, or we don't have the classes that we used to have together. And so then we have some what they call relational dissolution. And if you think about, again, they did a lot of their research looking at couples, romantic couples, and certainly couples grow in their relationship, but then there also are couples that decide not to be couples anymore. And so then you have relationship dissolution and specific stages and phases of deep penetration. And that's a really interesting literature to get into if you're interested in kind of the breakup stages and phases and what people do when they break up and the kinds of things they say and go through as they develop a narrative both to themselves, with the formerly significant other, and then also with their friendship network. There's really interesting strategies that are used in that process that they came up with. Then the last assumption is that self-disclosure, that concept, is at the core of this developmental process. And there's two kinds of self-disclosure. Sometimes self-disclosure is planned and we are strategic about it, like we're going to decide to reveal something to somebody and we decide when and where and the circumstances, how much we're going to disclose. And then sometimes disclosure can be non-strategic. We're caught up in the circumstances of the situation, and we decide to spontaneously disclose something. And some people, interestingly, have more control over their self-disclosure than others. Some people just sort of things just erupt and they come out, and others are very controlled and planned about it. And they came up with this concept called the stranger on the train phenomenon, because we don't always self-disclose, even if it's strategic or non-strategic. We don't always self-disclose everything, even to our closest friends. Sometimes there's safety in disclosing something to a stranger. And so you might find yourself telling a stranger something that's very deep, very personal, something you've held close to the vest for a long time, but you disclose it to a stranger on a plane or a train. The idea that you would disclose something to a seatmate in public transportation like that, knowing that you're not going to see them again, very unlikely that you will interact with them again. So you disclose something very intimate and very personal. But there's safety in that. You're sharing something with somebody in a moment. It makes sense in that situation, and you feel a freedom to kind of release that. Because in self-disclosure, remember back from symbolic interaction, as we're discussing and interacting with people, they're reflecting us back to ourselves. And so in some senses, we are developing our own thoughts and perspectives on ourselves and on the circumstances and situations, constructing our narrative. And part of doing that is sharing with someone. Well, if you're not comfortable sharing that with people that you know that are then going to know something about you that you don't want to share in that moment, well, that's the perfect opportunity, is to share it if it comes up with a stranger and see how they react or get their perspective and feedback, and that begins to kind of weave into your narrative about the situation. So really interesting theory from that perspective, the stranger on the train phenomenon, why people do that, when they do it, what it does for them in their own thinking about things. So let's take a look at this model. They use an onion as the model, and maybe if you've watched Shrek, you know that Shrek has this sequence when he's talking to the donkey, and he says, "Ogres are like onions." And so that little interaction with the donkey is exactly what this theory is saying, is that our personhood, our personalities are like onions in that we have layers to us. And the layers include all kinds of things: our worldview, our studies and knowledge, our tastes and preferences, simple biographical data, our concept of self, fears and emotions and fantasies that we have deep inside of us, our religious or spiritual convictions, paths and goals for life, aspirations that we have. So there's all kinds of dimensions to us, and we choose to disclose in some of these different areas, and so we call that the breadth of disclosure. So any given relationship in your life, how much do they know about you, and the breadth of what you've disclosed to them. But then there's the varying depth that we've allowed people to know about us. And the metaphor in this theory is an interesting one, and something for us to think about is when we disclose, so that they use a metaphor, and that people are, you've got this wedge, it's almost like you're splitting a log, you're splitting wood, and you've got this wedge that you've put in the wood and you're hammering in there. Is that really the metaphor, or is the metaphor one of opening up? Are people really prying into us, or are we opening up a crevasse and letting them deeper in a particular area of our life? Either way, the outer layers are more superficial information, are things that we manage in our public, our impression management, some of those outer layers that are relatively easy to know. These are things that you might put on Instagram or Facebook. It's very controlled, or your LinkedIn profile. So these are things that many people can know about you, and you're willing to disclose that widely. But then there are things that are deeper, that you share only with treasured friends, people that really know you. You feel comfortable and safe with them. So it's not something as simple as what your tastes in music are. It's something that a fear, or maybe an aspiration that you have later in life, or a deeply held religious conviction, or something that a concept of self, the way you think about yourself. And that's the depth. There are certain dimensions to intimacy, and this theory really gets at some of those, and I've put those in parentheses. If you think about how people can grow closer to us, they can grow closer to us in our mind. We can have really deep conversations about intellectual topics. They can grow deeper to us spiritually and really know what we think and believe about God and the universe and our place in it. And they can grow closer to us emotionally, where we become dependent on them in emotional areas. They know our fears. They know what our loves and our aspirations for life are, or our fantasies for life are. They can grow closest to us just in terms of activities. Shared activities are a strong basis for increasing intimacy. And then there can be physical intimacy, certainly in a couple relationship. And so this theory really gets at all of those areas of intimacy. And one of the ways of pursuing that is by disclosing, opening up ourselves to each other. And so that is what the model of the layers are. As we peel back the layers, we get to know people deeper and deeper. I'll leave you with a little photograph I took off of the Ponte Vecchio in Florence, Italy. Little plug for Europe term if you are thinking about studying abroad. A place that a lot of people, Europe and our study abroad term, really do have a lot of chance and opportunity to be self-reflective and think through who they're close to and how much they open up or don't open up, things like that. So we'll talk to you soon.